A cop secretly follows a lonely, small black girl through the empty town streets. 5 minutes later, he breaks down when he sees the truth behind the abandoned walls she slips through. What was the black girl hiding? And why did the cop break down in tears after seeing her? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The streetlights cast a pale glow on the empty streets as Officer Mark Daniels guided his patrol car through the quiet neighborhood. His experienced hands rested easily on the steering wheel while his eyes scanned the surroundings, a habit formed over years of service. The evening air had turned bitter, and his breath fogged slightly against the driver's side window. Mark adjusted the heat in his car, grateful for its warmth. The radio crackled occasionally with routine updates, but tonight had been unusually quiet. As he turned onto Church Street, his headlights swept across the old Presbyterian church, its weathered stone facade looking almost ghostly in the dim light. The small playground beside it came into view. Most nights it stood empty, the swings moving gently in the breeze like forgotten memories of daytime laughter. But tonight was different. His trained eye caught movement and he slowed the patrol car, keeping a careful distance. There, on a rusted bench near the slide, sat a young girl. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, her small frame hunched against the cold. Her dark skin seemed to blend with the shadows, but her pink jacket stood out clearly in his headlights. In her arms, she clutched a teddy bear that had seen better days, its fur matted and worn from years of love. Mark's heart tightened in his chest. The girl didn't look up as he watched, her eyes fixed firmly on the ground before her. Her shoulders trembled slightly, from cold or something else he couldn't tell. The teddy bear remained locked in her embrace like an anchor in a storm. A car drove past, its headlights briefly illuminating the playground in harsh white light. The girl, Ava, didn't even flinch. She remained still, lost in whatever thoughts held her attention so completely. The sight stirred something deep within Mark's chest, a mixture of concern and protective instinct that he'd learned to trust over his years on the force. Children didn't sit alone in playgrounds after dark, not without reason, not in this weather, not clutching teddy bears like lifelines. The wind picked up, rustling through the trees that lined the church property. Mark watched as it tugged at Ava's jacket and ruffled her hair. But still, she didn't move. Her stillness spoke volumes to his experienced eye. This wasn't a child who had lost track of time playing. This was something else entirely. He put the car in park, leaving the engine running. The heat continued to blow softly through the vents, a stark contrast to the chill he knew was settling over the playground. His fingers drummed thoughtfully on the steering wheel as he considered his next move. Something about this scene didn't sit right with him. Years of patrolling these streets had taught him to recognize when things were off, and right now, every instinct he had was telling him to stay put, to watch, to wait. As another gust of wind swept through the playground, causing the swings to creak mournfully, Mark settled deeper into his seat. He would keep watch, at least for a while longer. Sometimes, he knew, the most important part of his job was simply being present, being ready when someone needed help, even if they didn't know they needed it yet. Mark shifted in his patrol car seat, the leather creaking softly beneath him. He reached for the window control, and the glass slid down with a quiet hum. Occasionally, a stray leaf would dance across the pavement, the soft scraping sound echoing in the stillness. Time seemed to move differently in these quiet hours. Mark glanced at his watch, the illuminated face showing that an hour had passed since he'd first spotted the girl. The playground had grown darker as the last purple streaks of twilight faded from the sky, leaving only the artificial glow of streetlights to push back the shadows. Still, no adult had appeared, no worried parent calling out a name, no searching figure hurrying through the darkened streets. The girl remained alone on her bench, a small figure in the growing darkness. As Mark watched, she pulled her teddy bear even closer to her chest as if trying to draw warmth or comfort from its worn fabric. The sight made something shift in Mark's chest. He'd seen enough. His concern crystallized into determination as he reached for his door handle. The car door opened with a subtle creak, and he stepped out into the cold night air. His breath formed small clouds that dissipated quickly in the darkness. Moving with the careful precision that years on the force had taught him, Mark took a step forward. His eyes scanned the surrounding streets. checking for any movement, any sign of another person who might belong to this child. But the streets remained empty and silent. The sound of his boots on the pavement seemed unusually loud in the quiet night. As he drew closer, the girl, whose name was Ava, finally noticed him coming. Her head snapped up, and even in the dim light, Mark could see her eyes go wide. Fear and surprise flashed across her face. Mark stood several feet away, maintaining a distance he hoped would feel safe and non-threatening. Without warning, she stood up from the bench. The sudden movement sent a few leaves skittering across the ground, their dry rustling seeming unnaturally loud in the quiet night. The box in her hand made another gentle tinkling sound, like coins shifting against each other. Taking one final nervous look around, Ava turned and began walking down the narrow street. Her small figure was illuminated by the streetlights overhead, creating a lonely silhouette against the darkness. Her steps were quick but uncertain, and Mark could see her shoulders trembling. Whether from cold or fear, he couldn't tell. Mark hesitated for just a moment before following. He maintained a careful distance, not wanting to frighten her more than she already was. His footsteps, usually confident and steady, now fell as quietly as he could manage on the concrete. Every few steps, he glanced around, checking for any signs of danger in the growing shadows. The streets began to change as they walked. The well-maintained sidewalks of the town center gave way to cracked concrete and untrimmed hedges. Buildings pressed in closer on either side, their facades growing more weathered and worn. Many windows were dark, some boarded up, creating perfect squares of deeper darkness against the night sky. Ava's footsteps echoed off the buildings, creating a hollow sound that seemed to emphasize how alone she was. Her shivering had become more pronounced, and she pulled her teddy bear closer as she walked. The wooden box continued to jingle softly with each step, like a quiet melody accompanying their strange procession. The neighborhood grew more industrial, with old warehouses looming ahead. Mark's concern deepened as Ava turned suddenly, heading toward a narrow path that was almost hidden by tall weeds and untrimmed bushes. The path led toward an old warehouse, its windows broken and walls covered in fading graffiti. His heart pounded harder as he watched her small figure move toward the building, wondering what could possibly draw a young girl to such a dangerous place. As Ava disappeared through a gap in the warehouse wall, Mark paused. His hand instinctively moved to rest on his flashlight, but he hesitated to use it, not wanting to startle whoever might be inside. The old building loomed before him, its broken windows like hollow eyes staring down at him in the night. From inside, a sound caught his attention, the unmistakable sound of labored breathing. It was soft but clear in the stillness of the night, the kind of breathing that spoke of illness or distress. Mark moved closer to one of the cracked windows, careful to avoid the shards of glass that still clung to the frame. Through the grimy window, he could make out Ava's silhouette as she knelt beside what looked like a nest of blankets piled on the floor. In the dim light filtering through the broken windows, he saw another figure, a young boy lying on the makeshift bed. The boy's skin was pale, almost ghostly in the weak light, and his body shook with visible tremors despite the blankets wrapped around him. Mark took a deep breath and stepped through the same entrance Ava had used. His boots made a soft crunching sound as they met scattered debris on the warehouse floor. The noise, though quiet, echoed in the empty space. Ava whirled around at the sound, her eyes wide with fear and glistening with tears. She moved instinctively closer to the boy, as if trying to shield him with her small body. Her teddy bear remained clutched tightly in one hand, while the other reached out protectively toward the sick child. "Who's this?" Mark asked, keeping his voice gentle and steady despite the urgency he felt seeing the boy's condition. He stayed where he was, knowing that any sudden movement might frighten them further. Ava's face crumpled, tears finally spilling over onto her cheeks. "This is my brother," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the vast space of the warehouse. Mark's mind worked quickly as he processed what he was seeing. The contrast between them was stark. Ava with her dark skin, and the boy, clearly of a different race, lying pale and sick before him. Yet the protective way she hovered over him, the obvious concern in her eyes, spoke of a bond that went beyond biological connections. His expression softened, and he felt his professional demeanor give way to something more gentle, more personal. "It's okay," he said quietly. his voice carrying clearly in the stillness of the warehouse. "You're safe now." Ava's grip on her teddy bear loosened slightly as she looked at him, her eyes filled with equal measures of hope and bone-deep exhaustion. She gave a small, slow nod, as if allowing herself, for the first time that night, to believe those words might be true. Mark moved closer to where the children huddled, his footsteps careful and measured on the debris-strewn floor. Moonlight filtered through the warehouse's broken panels, casting silvery beams across their faces. Lowering himself to one knee beside the makeshift bed, Mark kept his movements slow and deliberate. "Is he sick?" he asked softly, gesturing toward Michael with a slight nod. His voice remained steady, though his heart ached at the sight before him. Tears welled up in Ava's eyes, spilling over as she wiped her cheek with the back of her hand. "He's been sick for days," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We have nowhere else to go." The words hung heavy in the damp air between them. Mark reached out carefully, pressing 2 fingers against Michael's neck to check his pulse. The boy's skin felt clammy and cool to the touch, his heartbeat rapid under Mark's fingers. Worry creased his forehead as he noted the boy's shallow breathing and the way his chest struggled with each intake of air. Ava's small hands fumbled with the wooden box she'd been carrying. She held it out toward Mark, the few coins inside rattling quietly. "We were trying to save up for medicine," she explained, her voice barely above a whisper. The meager collection of coins told a story of desperate children trying to solve an impossible situation on their own. The pieces clicked together in Mark's mind. 2 children, different races but bound by circumstance, alone and vulnerable in this cold warehouse. His jaw tightened as he considered what might have driven them here, what they might be running from. Standing slowly, Mark stepped away from the children and toward the warehouse entrance. He unclipped his radio from his belt, pressing the button with practiced ease. "Dispatch, this is Officer Daniels," he spoke quietly but clearly. "I need medical assistance at the old Riverside warehouse, west entrance. 2 minors, one showing signs of illness. Situation stable but urgent." The radio crackled with confirmation as Mark turned back to the children. Ava sat clutching her teddy bear, her eyes fixed on him with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "Help is on the way," he assured her, his voice gentle and firm. Ava's shoulders visibly relaxed at his words. She looked down at her brother, her small fingers reaching out to brush his hair back from his forehead, in a gesture so tender it made Mark's throat tighten. The simple act of comfort spoke volumes about the bond between these 2 children, who had clearly been looking out for each other when no one else would. He settled down near the children, keeping a respectful distance while maintaining a reassuring presence, his body angled to appear less threatening. "Ava," he said gently, his voice warm and steady. "Can you tell me how you 2 ended up here?" The girl's fingers tightened around her teddy bear, her knuckles turning white against the worn brown fur. She glanced at Michael, then back at Mark, uncertainty flickering across her face. Her shoulders tensed as if carrying an invisible weight. After a long moment, she took a shaky breath, gathering her courage. "We ran away," she whispered, her voice trembling like autumn leaves in the wind. "Michael is my brother." She paused, swallowing hard, her throat working with the effort. "He's my stepbrother, really. We're from the same home." Mark's brow furrowed as he listened, his trained mind already connecting the dots, drawing from years of similar cases. He remained silent, giving her space to continue, his calm presence encouraging her to share more. "After Mom died 6 months ago," Ava's voice cracked like thin ice, "Dad changed. He started drinking more. He'd get so angry." Her small frame shuddered with the memory, her fingers clutching the teddy bear even tighter. "He'd hit us. Michael got it worse because—" She looked down at her sleeping brother, tears rolling down her cheeks and dropping onto her worn jacket. "Because he's his real son." Mark's jaw clenched, his expression hardening as he controlled the anger rising in his chest. The familiar weight of helplessness settled over him. Years of police work hadn't dulled his reaction to stories of children being hurt by those meant to protect them. His hands instinctively curled into fists before he forced them to relax. "The white powder made everything worse," Ava continued, her voice barely audible above the gentle hum of the night. Sometimes he'd forget to buy food. Michael got sick, but Dad wouldn't take him to the doctor. He just kept getting worse and worse. The sudden wail of approaching sirens cut through the night air, growing louder with each passing second. Red and white lights began to flash through the warehouse windows, casting dancing shadows on the walls and illuminating the dust motes floating in the air. Mark stood up as paramedics rushed in with their equipment, their movements swift but careful, their faces professionally composed. They worked quickly, checking Michael's vitals and gently transferring him onto a stretcher. The boy didn't stir, his face pale against the white sheets, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Ava watched with wide, frightened eyes as they secured him for transport, her whole body trembling with barely contained worry. Mark moved closer to Ava, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder, feeling her slight frame beneath the thin fabric of her jacket. "I'll stay with you," he promised softly, meaning every word. She looked up at him, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. But there was something new there, a small spark of trust beginning to shine through the fear, like the first ray of sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The patrol car's engine hummed steadily as Mark guided it through the empty streets, following the ambulance's flashing lights ahead. Ava sat quietly in the passenger seat, her teddy bear clutched tightly to her chest, her small frame dwarfed by the vehicle's interior. The dashboard clock glowed 7:52 p.m., and through the windshield, street lamps cast long shadows across the pavement. Mark glanced occasionally at Ava, noting how she stared straight ahead, her eyes fixed on the ambulance carrying her brother. Her shoulders remained tense, and she flinched slightly whenever they passed under particularly bright streetlights. The hospital's emergency entrance blazed with fluorescent lighting as they pulled up behind the ambulance. Medical staff were already wheeling Michael through the automatic doors, their movements swift and practiced. Mark helped Ava out of the car, her hand cold and trembling as she gripped his fingers. Inside, the sharp smell of antiseptic filled their nostrils. The emergency room buzzed with activity, nurses moving purposefully between curtained areas, the soft beeping of medical equipment, and the murmur of voices creating a constant background noise. Ava pressed closer to Mark's side, her free hand clutching his uniform sleeve as they watched Michael disappear behind a set of swinging doors. "Let me check on your brother," Mark said softly, leading Ava to a nearby chair in the waiting area. The harsh overhead lights made her look even more exhausted, highlighting the dark circles under her eyes and the worn state of her clothes. The head nurse, a woman with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a neat bun, listened intently as Mark explained the situation. Her expression remained professional, but her eyes softened with concern as she glanced at Ava. "The boy's condition is serious but treatable," she assured Mark in low tones. "From what we can tell, he's fighting an infection, likely from consuming contaminated food. We're starting him on antibiotics right away." Mark nodded, relief washing over him. He returned to where Ava sat, her small frame nearly swallowed by the institutional chair. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across her face as she hugged her teddy bear, her feet barely touching the floor. Settling into the chair beside her, Mark leaned forward slightly, keeping his voice gentle. "Ava, who is your father?" She kept her eyes fixed on her scuffed shoes, her fingers working nervously at the teddy bear's worn fur. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled like a leaf in the wind. "He's not a good man. We ran because we had to." The hospital corridor had grown quieter as the night shift settled in. Under the subdued lighting, Ava sat perfectly still, her eyes tracking every movement of the nurses as they walked past. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking time as it crept past 9 p.m. Mark shifted in his chair, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, bringing himself closer to Ava's eye level. "Ava," he said, his voice carrying both gentleness and quiet authority, "I need you to tell me more." She clutched her teddy bear tighter, her fingers working through its matted fur. After a long moment, she drew in a shaky breath. "We left 3 days ago," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "We didn't have much, just the coins from our piggy bank." Her eyes dropped to the wooden box beside her chair. "The first night was really cold," she continued, her shoulders hunching slightly at the memory. We stayed outside behind some stores, but then—" her voice wavered. "Then Michael got sick. This homeless man shared his food with us on the second night, but after that Michael couldn't stop throwing up." Mark's hands clenched involuntarily, his jaw tightening as he listened. The thought of these children spending nights on the street made his heart ache. "The warehouse." Ava's voice grew smaller. "We found it because we needed somewhere to hide, somewhere safe. Michael was so sick, and we were scared." She trailed off, her small frame seeming to collapse in on itself. Mark fought to control the anger rising in his chest, not at Ava, but at the circumstances that had forced two children into such desperate measures. "We didn't really have a plan," she admitted, her voice cracking. "We just knew we couldn't stay there anymore. Not with him." A nurse approached them then, her soft-soled shoes making little sound on the linoleum floor. She smiled warmly at Ava before turning to Mark. "I wanted to let you know that Michael's condition is stabilizing," she reported quietly. "The antibiotics are working well. We expect he'll be much better by morning." The tension in Ava's shoulders visibly released at these words. She hugged her teddy bear fiercely, pressing her face into its worn fabric. Tears glistened in her eyes, but these were different from before. Tears of relief rather than fear. Mark reached out, placing his warm hand gently on Ava's small back. "You did well, Ava," he said softly but firmly. "I need you to trust me now. We're going to make sure you and Michael are safe." Ava nodded, her eyes shining with a mixture of hope and exhaustion as the night settled deeper around them. The hospital's fluorescent lights had dimmed for the night shift, casting soft shadows across the waiting room. Mark sat beside Ava, fighting back his own exhaustion as he watched her small fingers work nervously at the worn fur of her teddy bear. The clock on the wall showed 11:15 p.m., its soft ticking the only sound besides the occasional squeak of nurses' shoes on the linoleum floor. Mark leaned forward, knowing he needed answers. "Ava," he said gently but firmly, "I need you to tell me who your father is and where you live." Ava's shoulders tensed. She lifted her eyes to meet his, and Mark could see the internal struggle playing across her face. "His name is Peter Matthews," she finally whispered, her voice trembling. "We lived on Maple Street, but I don't want to go back." The last words came out in a rush, thick with fear. "We saved up for weeks," she continued, gesturing to the wooden box. "Every penny we could find. After—" she swallowed hard. "After he hurt Michael really bad last time, we knew we had to leave." Mark's radio crackled, breaking the heavy silence that followed her words. He reached for it, making a quick decision. He called Officer Sam Thompson, one of his most trusted colleagues, asking him to come to the hospital. Within 20 minutes, Sam arrived, his broad frame filling the doorway of the waiting room. Despite his size, his presence brought a gentle warmth to the space. He smiled at Ava, pulling up a chair beside her. "Hey there," Sam said softly, his voice carrying a natural comfort. "I'm Officer Thompson, but you can call me Sam. I'm going to stay right here with you while Officer Daniels checks on something, okay?" Ava nodded slightly, studying Sam's kind face. "You won't leave?" she asked in a small voice. "I'll be right here," Sam assured her, his eyes sincere. "You're safe now." Mark stood, sharing a meaningful look with Sam. They'd worked together long enough that words weren't necessary. Sam understood the gravity of the situation. Walking through the hospital's quiet corridors, Mark's determination grew with each step. The automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss and the cold night air hit his face. He climbed into his patrol car, his mind racing as he started the engine. The streets were empty as he drove toward Maple Street. Houses lined both sides, their windows dark, their facades showing signs of wear and neglect. Each home seemed to hold its own untold story, but tonight, Mark was focused on just one. The houses on Maple Street stood like tired sentinels in the night, their weathered facades telling stories of better days. Mark pulled his patrol car to a stop, scanning the row of homes with practiced eyes. Under the dim streetlights, he could see paint peeling from wooden siding and sagging gutters that spoke of years of neglect. The occasional flicker of a television through curtained windows provided the only signs of life on the quiet street. Number 247 matched Ava's description perfectly. a small two-story house with faded blue paint and a crooked mailbox that tilted precariously to one side. The front yard was a maze of abandoned toys, their bright plastic dulled by exposure to the elements. An overturned lawn chair lay near a patch of overgrown grass, its metal frame rusted from rain and time. Dead leaves collected in corners of the porch, skittering across weathered boards with each gust of wind. Mark's footsteps crunched on the gravel path as he approached the front door, his shadow stretching long in the glow of distant streetlights. His training kicked in as he noted details. A broken porch light with exposed wires, empty beer bottles tucked behind a wilting potted plant, blinds drawn tight across all windows. A child's bicycle lay on its side near the steps, chain rusted and seat torn. The air felt heavy with tension as he raised his fist and knocked firmly on the door. The sound echoed in the quiet street, startling a stray cat that darted from beneath the porch. For a moment, nothing moved. Then came the shuffling of feet from inside, followed by the distinctive sound of someone stumbling against furniture and muttering under their breath. The porch boards creaked under Mark's feet as he waited, every sense alert, his right hand instinctively close to his belt. Before the door opened, headlights from the side of the house caught his attention. A car's engine roared to life and Mark's heart stopped when he recognized the vehicle pulling out of the driveway. Emily, his wife. The realization crashed into him like a wave, leaving him momentarily paralyzed. The beam from her headlights washed over him, and he turned sharply, catching sight of her profile as she glanced back. Their eyes met for a split second before she looked away, the car accelerating down the dimly lit street. Mark's pulse raced as he reached for his phone, his fingers numb with disbelief. He dialed her number and brought the phone to his ear, the ringtone piercing the silence around him. On the third ring, Emily's voice came through, steady and controlled. "Hey, Mark," she answered, a touch too casual. "What's up?" Mark's jaw tightened. "Where are you?" There was a pause, just long enough to feel unnatural. "I'm home." "Why?" The lie hung between them, heavy and suffocating. Mark's hand curled into a fist. He forced himself to take a steadying breath before replying, his voice dangerously calm. "I see." "Is everything okay?" Emily's voice sounded concerned now, layered with a tone that twisted the knife of betrayal deeper. Mark couldn't bring himself to answer. He ended the call without another word and turned back to the house, his mind racing with questions he wasn't ready to face. The door in front of him creaked open, and Peter Matthews stood in the threshold. Peter's appearance matched the house, worn down and neglected. His hair was unwashed and wild, his clothes wrinkled and stained with what looked like yesterday's dinner. Dark circles rimmed bloodshot eyes that narrowed suspiciously at the sight of Mark's uniform. The sharp smell of alcohol wafted through the doorway. "Who are you, and do you have a warrant?" Peter's voice came out rough and defensive, his fingers gripping the doorframe tightly as he swayed slightly on his feet. Mark met his gaze steadily, his posture non-threatening but ready. "I'm Officer Daniels," he said, voice firm and controlled. "I'm here because of Ava and Michael." The change in Peter's expression was immediate and dramatic. His face drained of color, and his grip on the doorframe tightened until his knuckles turned white. Confusion flickered across his features, followed quickly by alarm as understanding dawned in his clouded eyes. His mouth opened and closed without forming words. Mark took a deliberate step forward, his presence filling the doorway. The wooden boards groaned beneath his feet as he positioned himself where Peter couldn't easily close the door. "We need to talk, Peter. Now." The living room fell into a thick silence as Mark stepped forward, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet, their aged protest echoing in the tense atmosphere. Peter's earlier smugness melted away, replaced by a guarded wariness that made his whole body tense, his shoulders hunching like a cornered animal. "What do you want?" Peter's voice came out rough and defensive, but Mark caught the slight tremor underneath, a hint of desperation that betrayed his tough exterior. His hands fidgeted restlessly at his sides, picking at loose threads on his worn jeans. Mark pushed down the storm of emotions about his wife Emily, forcing himself to focus on the task at hand. The betrayal stung fresh in his mind, but he couldn't let it cloud his judgment now. His jaw tightened as he met Peter's bloodshot eyes. "I got a report that you've been abusing your kids. They're in the hospital now." The words tasted bitter in his mouth. Peter's face transformed in an instant. The color drained from his already pale cheeks, and his eyes widened with unmistakable panic. The change was so dramatic it made him look like a different person entirely. "My kid, where are they? Are they okay?" His voice cracked on the last word, hands reaching out unconsciously, grasping at empty air. Mark's brow furrowed as he studied the genuine concern that flashed across Peter's face. It didn't match the monster he'd imagined after seeing those children huddled in that warehouse. The disconnect made his head spin. "Don't act like you care now," he spat, disgust evident in his tone, his fingers flexing instinctively. "I never wanted to hurt them." Peter's voice broke and he slumped against the wall, suddenly looking older and more broken. His shoulders sagged under an invisible weight. I lost control. After my wife died, everything fell apart." His words hung in the stale air between them, heavy with regret and pain. The afternoon light filtering through dusty windows cast harsh shadows across his face, highlighting every line of suffering. Mark felt his professional facade crack slightly as he took in the complicated man before him. This wasn't just a simple case of good versus evil. It was a story of loss, addiction, and a family torn apart by grief. The realization sat uncomfortably in his chest. But sympathy couldn't erase what he'd done to those children, couldn't wash away the bruises and fear in their eyes. Taking a step back, Mark's expression hardened once more. "I'm taking you in, Peter. You'll get to see your kids, but only from a distance." He reached for his handcuffs as Peter turned around without resistance, a tear rolling down his weathered cheek. The metal clicked shut around Peter's wrists with a finality that echoed through the empty room. The patrol car's headlights cut through the darkness as Mark pulled into the hospital entrance. In the rearview mirror, Peter's face looked ghostly pale under the harsh fluorescent lights of the parking lot. His eyes darted back and forth, a storm of emotions playing across his features, fear mingling with desperate hope. Inside the hospital's sterile halls, Mark kept a firm grip on Peter's arm as they walked. The late-night quiet was broken only by their footsteps and the occasional beep of medical equipment. Peter's head swiveled from side to side, searching each doorway they passed, his breathing becoming more rapid with each step. When they reached the children's ward, Peter stopped abruptly. Through the doorway, Ava sat in a chair pulled close to Michael's bed, her small hand resting protectively on her brother's arm. The teddy bear lay in her lap, its worn fur catching the dim light. The sight of his children hit Peter like a physical blow, making his knees wobble beneath him. "Please," Peter whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Just let me see them for a moment." His hands trembled in their cuffs. Mark studied Peter's face, weighing the request against his duty to protect the children. After a long moment, he gave a curt nod, but positioned himself between Peter and the doorway, maintaining a safe distance. The sound of movement made Ava look up. Her eyes widened when she saw her father, and fear flickered across her face like a shadow. But as she continued to stare, her expression shifted to something more complex, a cautious recognition that held neither love nor hate. Tears welled up in Peter's eyes as he took in the sight of his children, Michael's pale face against the white hospital sheets, Ava's protective stance beside him. "I'm so sorry," he choked out, the words barely audible. His shoulders shook with silent sobs. Ava didn't move from her chair, didn't speak a word. She just hugged her bear closer to her chest, her eyes never leaving her father's face. Her expression was unreadable, a mixture of emotions too complicated for her young face to fully express. Mark stepped forward, placing a hand on Peter's shoulder to signal the end of the visit. Peter nodded in understanding, tears streaming freely down his face now as Mark guided him away from the door. As they turned to leave, Ava's expression shifted again, revealing the turmoil of a child caught between fear and longing for her father. Mark guided Peter through the hospital's automatic doors, the night air hitting them with a bitter chill that made them both instinctively pull their jackets tighter. The parking lot was nearly empty now, their footsteps echoing against the asphalt like lonely drum beats in the darkness. Peter twisted around for one final glance at the building, his eyes lingering on the illuminated windows, where somewhere inside, his children slept. He let out a heavy sigh that seemed to carry the weight of his mistakes before facing forward. The patrol car's engine hummed to life, its headlights cutting through the darkness and casting long shadows across the empty spaces. Neither man spoke during the drive to the station, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. Mark's knuckles were white against the steering wheel, his grip betraying his inner turmoil, while Peter sat motionless in the back, his reflection ghostly in the rearview mirror like a haunting reminder of what he'd become. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as they entered the police station, casting harsh shadows on tired faces. The night shift officers looked up from their desks, curiosity evident in their expressions, as Mark led Peter past the row of holding cells, their footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. The booking process was mechanical, fingerprints pressed firmly into ink, photographs taken against stark white walls, paperwork filled out in triplicate. Peter complied without resistance, his movements slow and defeated, like a man who had finally run out of fight. Just as Mark was finishing the last form, his phone vibrated in his pocket with an urgency he wished he could ignore. Emily's name flashed across the screen, bringing with it a wave of guilt. He considered letting it go to voicemail but answered anyway, knowing that would only make things worse. "When are you coming home?" Emily's voice was taut, carefully controlled, but he could hear the worry underneath. Mark's jaw clenched, the muscle working beneath his skin. "Not tonight. I'm busy." He ended the call without waiting for a response, shoving the phone back into his pocket, as if it burned him. From his cell, Peter watched the exchange, his expression unreadable as he observed the tension in Mark's shoulders. The officer who'd arrested him was fighting his own battles. That much was clear. Something in Peter's eyes suggested he recognized a familiar struggle. Mark leaned against the wall, feeling the weight of the night pressing down on him like a physical thing. His eyes drifted to Peter, who sat on the thin mattress of his cell, head bowed and staring at the floor as if searching for answers in the worn concrete. The man's face was a map of regret and exhaustion, deep lines etched by years of poor choices, mirroring Mark's own fatigue. In that moment, despite the bars between them, they were just two men grappling with the consequences of their decisions. "I didn't want this," Peter's voice cut through the silence, drawing Mark's attention to the holding cell. The words hung in the air, heavy with regret. Mark pushed back from his desk and walked over to the cell, his arms crossed over his chest as he studied the man behind the bars. "Why did you hurt them?" he asked, keeping his voice low but firm. Peter's shoulders slumped as he leaned forward on the small bench. "After Sarah died." His voice cracked slightly at his wife's name. Everything fell apart. The pain was too much. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. The doctor prescribed painkillers for my back injury, but I started taking more than I should. He ran a trembling hand through his disheveled hair. The alcohol made it worse. When I couldn't get pills, the withdrawal. Peter's eyes grew distant, remembering. I'd get so angry, so scared. The grief felt like it was eating me alive, and I lost control. Tears welled up in Peter's bloodshot eyes as he continued. I scared them. I didn't mean to, but I did. I thought I could fix it, but I was too ashamed to ask for help. His voice was barely above a whisper now, thick with emotion. Mark felt the familiar surge of anger at child abusers, but something else tugged at him too. A reluctant understanding of how quickly life could spiral out of control. Still, he maintained his professional demeanor, his face carefully neutral. I'll have to keep you here while I look into this, Mark said, turning away from the cell. Please, Peter called out after him, his voice breaking. Just make sure they're okay. Mark paused mid-step but didn't turn around. The weight of the night pressed down on his shoulders as he stood there, caught between duty and the complicated mess of emotions this case had stirred up. The first hints of dawn were creeping over the horizon as Mark's patrol car pulled into his driveway. His muscles ached with exhaustion as he climbed out, each step up to the front door feeling heavier than the last. The house stood quiet and dark, save for the soft glow seeping from their bedroom window. Inside, Mark's footsteps echoed through the silent house. He paused at the bedroom doorway, taking in the sight of Emily lying in bed, her face illuminated by the bedside lamp. Even from where he stood, he could see the redness around her eyes, evidence of tears shed. His heart twisted at the sight, but the anger he'd pushed aside at the station bubbled up again, mingling with confusion. He moved to stand at the foot of the bed, crossing his arms over his chest. "Why did I see you at Peter Matthews's place tonight?" His voice came out low and controlled, masking the storm of emotions underneath. Emily's eyes widened as she sat up quickly, the blankets rustling around her. Shock and hurt flashed across her face, followed by indignation. "How could you even think I'd do something behind your back?" she shot back, her voice trembling slightly. Mark's eyes narrowed as he studied her, searching for cracks in her resolve. "Then explain," he said firmly, the tension in the room thick enough to cut through. A heavy sigh escaped Emily as her shoulders dropped, the defiance in her expression fading to one of weary honesty. She twisted the edge of the blanket between her fingers, eyes downcast. "Peter's wife, Rachel, was an old friend of mine from college. After she died suddenly, he fell apart." She looked up at Mark, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "He's been battling severe depression and PTSD ever since. Their kids were caught in the middle of it, neglected and alone. I started checking in on them whenever I could." Mark's brow furrowed, his rigid posture slowly beginning to soften as the pieces fell into place. The anger in his chest ebbed, replaced by a gnawing guilt for doubting her. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice rough around the edges. Emily's gaze dropped back to the blanket as she continued. "I thought I could handle it myself. I didn't want to burden you, Mark. You already have so much on your plate, and I thought I could help without dragging you into it." Her voice cracked slightly. "But tonight," Peter called, frantic. "He said the kids were missing and I had to go. I was scared of what he might do in his state." Mark's jaw clenched as the weight of the night pressed down on him. The sight of Emily's car pulling away from Peter's house replayed in his mind, but now it was tinted with understanding rather than anger. "I found them," he said, his tone softening. "Ava and Michael. They're safe at the hospital." Emily's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening with relief as tears spilled over. "Thank God," she whispered, the words heavy with emotion. She shifted to the edge of the bed and reached for Mark's arm. "Are they okay?" Mark nodded, a small, tired smile forming at the corner of his lips. "Michael was weak, but he's recovering. Ava's been looking out for him this whole time. They're stronger than I could have imagined." Emily's eyes shone with a mix of admiration and sadness. "Those poor kids," she said, her voice trembling. "We need to help them, Mark. Not just tonight, for as long as they need it." Mark's expression softened further, and he moved to sit beside her on the bed. The exhaustion of the night clung to him, but so did the clarity that had emerged from the chaos. "We will," he promised, meeting her gaze. "But we can't just help the kids. Peter needs help too, if he's ever going to be a father to them again." Emily nodded, understanding deepening the lines of worry on her face. "I'll do what I can, both as a doctor and as someone who knew Rachel. Maybe it's time we both support him together." "I had to arrest Peter," Mark said, his voice low and tired, each word seeming to cost him energy he didn't have. "He admitted to everything, but he's broken, Emily. He's lost." His words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of their meaning. The clock on the nightstand ticked steadily, marking each moment of their shared burden. Emily nodded slowly, her expression a mix of professional concern and personal anguish. Her normally steady hands trembled slightly in her lap. "We can't let the kids go back to that, Mark. They need safety." Her fingers twisted in the bedsheet as she spoke, her medical training and human compassion clearly at war within her. The morning birds chirped outside, their cheerful song a stark contrast to the heaviness in the room. "I know," Mark agreed, running his hand over his face, feeling the stubble from his sleepless night. "I'm going to keep him in custody for a few days. Give me time to gather evidence, figure out the next steps. He paused, considering the complexity of the situation, his police training wrestling with his emotions. Those kids deserve better. They deserve a chance at normal. Mark reached out and placed his hand over Emily's, feeling the slight tremor in her fingers. The simple touch seemed to ground them both. "We need to help them, Emily," he said softly. "Not just as a cop or a doctor, but as people who care. They need advocates, not just professionals." Their eyes met, and in that moment they shared a silent understanding. This wasn't just another case or patient. This was about two children who needed them. The morning sun caught Emily's tears, making them sparkle as she squeezed his hand in response, a gesture that spoke volumes about their shared resolve. Mark stood up, his muscles protesting after the long night. His joints cracked quietly as he stretched, reminding him of the physical toll of his profession. He headed for the bathroom, and soon the sound of running water filled the air. Steam began rising above the shower curtain, curling in the morning light that streamed through the small window, creating ethereal patterns that danced and swirled in the golden rays. Next day, Ava sat quietly by Michael's bed, her small fingers absently stroking the worn fur of her tattered bear. The steady beep of monitors filled the peaceful silence of the room. When the door opened, Ava looked up to see Mark entering, his uniform neat and pressed despite the exhaustion evident in his eyes. Emily followed close behind, her gentle smile bringing a warmth that matched the morning light. Something in Ava's expression softened at the sight of them both, like a tiny flower beginning to unfold. Michael stirred in his bed, his color much better than the previous night. His eyes fluttered open, focusing on their visitors. "Hi," he whispered, his voice scratchy but stronger than before. Emily moved to check his vital signs, her movements careful and deliberate. "How are you feeling this morning, Michael?" she asked, her voice warm and professional at the same time. "Better," Michael managed, attempting a small smile. Mark knelt beside Ava's chair, bringing himself to her eye level. His badge caught the sunlight, glinting softly. "Ava," he said gently, "we need to talk about what happens next." He watched as she hugged her bear closer, her knuckles whitening slightly. "You and Michael won't be going back to your father right now." Ava's eyes widened, a mix of hope and uncertainty swimming in their depths. "You won't make us go back?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, fragile as tissue paper. "No," Mark assured her firmly. "Not unless you're safe. We promise." He glanced at Emily, who nodded in agreement. Emily stepped closer, her hand resting lightly on the foot of Michael's bed. "Actually," she said, her voice gentle, "Mark and I were thinking you both could come stay at our house for a while. Would you like that?" Ava turned to look at her brother, their eyes meeting in silent communication. Michael gave a weak nod, and Ava turned back to Emily and Mark. "Okay," she whispered, and for the first time since they'd met her, a tiny spark of hope flickered in her eyes. The morning sunlight seemed to grow warmer, wrapping around them all like a protective blanket as they sat together in the quiet hospital room, the first tentative threads of trust beginning to weave between them. Emily then took the kids home. Emily pulled into the driveway of their modest two-story home, its blue shutters and well-tended flower boxes offering a welcoming sight. The aroma of fresh coffee drifted through the air as Emily unlocked the front door, the scent escaping into the crisp afternoon. Ava paused at the threshold, her small hand gripping the doorframe. Her eyes scanned the warm interior, the comfortable couch, the soft throw pillows, the family photos on the walls. After a moment's hesitation, she stepped inside, Michael following close behind. "Let me show you where you'll be staying," Emily said softly, leading them up the stairs. The guest room she'd prepared was cozy, with two twin beds covered in quilts in cheerful blues and greens. A small nightlight sat on the bedside table, its gentle glow already providing comfort in the shadowy corners. Ava's eyes lingered on it, her grip on her bear loosening slightly. Emily moved with practiced ease, warming milk on the stove for hot cocoa. Ava watched from her perch at the counter, her eyes following Emily's movements as she stirred in chocolate and a touch of vanilla. The simple domestic act seemed to ease some of the tension from her small shoulders. Michael sat at the kitchen table, his hospital pallor already improving in the warm atmosphere. When Emily placed a mug of cocoa topped with mini marshmallows in front of him, his face lit up with a genuine smile. He took a careful sip, leaving a small chocolate mustache that made him look his age for the first time since they'd found him. Ava wrapped her hands around her own mug, the warmth seeping into her cold fingers. She looked up at Emily, her voice barely audible but clear. "Thank you." Mark returned to the police station, the exhaustion of the night still clinging to him. Inside, the dim fluorescent lights hummed softly, casting a sterile glow over the holding cells. Peter Matthews sat on the bench in one of the cells, his posture slumped and eyes hollow with defeat. The sight of him was a stark reminder of how far he had fallen. Mark approached the cell, his expression firm but less harsh than before. Peter's eyes lifted slowly, a mix of wariness and resignation crossing his face. He paused, watching as Peter's gaze dropped back to the floor. "I'm willing to release you, but only on one condition. You go to rehab. You get the help you need, not for yourself, but for Ava and Michael." Peter's shoulders shook as he drew in a deep, shuddering breath. The weight of Mark's words settled over him, and he nodded slowly. "I'll do it," he said, his voice hoarse. "I'll do whatever it takes." Mark's eyes softened with a hint of empathy. "Good. I'll take you to the Grove. It's a rehabilitation center just outside of town that specializes in addiction treatment and grief counseling." With a signal to the officer on duty, the cell door was unlocked, and Peter stepped out, swaying slightly before steadying himself. Mark placed a supportive hand on his shoulder and led him out of the station. The dawn light filtered through the windows, casting a pale glow on the worn linoleum floors. The drive to the Grove was silent, the hum of the car engine filling the space between them. Peter stared out the window, eyes unfocused as memories and regrets played out in his mind. Mark kept his attention on the road, his own thoughts drifting between the father beside him and the children waiting back at his house. When they arrived at the rehabilitation center, a nurse greeted them, her warm smile a stark contrast to Peter's haunted expression. Mark exchanged a few words with the intake counselor, outlining Peter's situation before turning to face him. "This is your chance, Peter," Mark said, his tone serious but not unkind. "Take it for Ava and Michael. They deserve it, and so do you." Peter's eyes met Mark's, gratitude and determination mingling in their depths. "I will," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Thank you." Mark watched as Peter was guided into the facility, the doors closing behind him with a quiet finality. He stood there for a moment, the cool morning air brushing against his skin, and allowed himself a deep breath. The days that followed were a blur of activity. Mark and Emily worked tirelessly to ensure Ava and Michael felt secure, coordinating with social services and keeping them engaged with simple routines that brought a sense of normalcy. Ava's guarded demeanor softened little by little, and Michael's laughter began to echo in the halls again. At the end of those few days, Mark sat on the porch, the evening sun casting warm hues over the town. Emily joined him, her hand resting on his arm. "He's in the right place," she said softly. Mark nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing. "It's a start," he replied. The road ahead was long, but for the first time, hope seemed within reach. A few days later, Mark and Emily pulled into the parking lot of the Grove Rehabilitation Center. The building stood proud against the morning sky, its red brick facade softened by well-maintained gardens and neat pathways. The contrast between the peaceful surroundings and the inner struggles of its residents wasn't lost on either of them. Inside, the air held a subtle scent of lemon cleaner and coffee. Mark approached the front desk while Emily took in their surroundings. Gentle music played in the background, mixing with hushed conversations from nearby rooms. Several residents sat in comfortable chairs, some reading, others talking quietly with visitors. "We're here to see Peter Matthews," Mark said to the receptionist, his badge glinting under the fluorescent lights. A staff member led them down a corridor to a small meeting room. Peter sat at a table, wearing navy sweatpants and a gray t-shirt that seemed too big for his frame. His eyes, though tired, held more clarity than they had in the station. When they entered, Peter's head snapped up, his face flushed with a mixture of surprise and shame. "You didn't have to come," he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily stepped forward, her professional demeanor softened by compassion. "We're here because you need help, and so do your children." Peter's eyes welled up at the mention of Ava and Michael. His hands fidgeted with the sleeve of his shirt as Mark explained that the children were safe, staying with them temporarily. "They're adjusting well," Mark said, keeping his voice steady. "Michael's health has improved significantly." Peter nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When he found his voice again, it was thick with emotion. Mark outlined the plan they'd developed with the rehabilitation center. Peter would complete the program, attending therapy and addiction counseling. If he showed consistent progress, he could earn supervised visits with his children. Peter's hands trembled as he wiped away a tear that had escaped down his cheek. "Thank you," he whispered. And for the first time since they'd met him, his eyes held a spark of genuine hope. Before they left, Mark placed a reassuring hand on Peter's shoulder. He and Emily shared a look, silently reaffirming their commitment to seeing this through. Back in their house, Ava sat quietly by the window, her small fingers tracing patterns on the glass as she watched autumn leaves dance in the breeze. Nearby, Michael lay on his stomach, pushing a vintage red toy car back and forth across the carpet. The toy, discovered by Mark in a dusty corner of the attic, had brought the first genuine smile to the boy's face since their arrival. Emily watched the children from the doorway, her heart aching with tenderness for these two souls who had already endured so much. Taking a deep breath, she approached Ava with gentle steps. "Would you like to help me bake cookies?" Emily asked, settling beside the young girl. Ava's eyes widened slightly, and after a moment's hesitation, she nodded, a shy smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. In the kitchen, Emily showed Ava how to measure flour and sugar. When Ava poured the flour into the bowl, a small cloud puffed up, coating their hands in white powder. A tiny giggle escaped Ava's lips, the sound like music in the warm kitchen. Mark entered, leaning against the doorframe as he watched them work. The sight of Ava's shoulders relaxed, her guard finally lowering, made his chest tight with emotion. He turned to Michael, who had followed him into the kitchen. "Hey buddy, want to help me set the table?" Mark asked, and Michael nodded eagerly, carefully carrying napkins to the dining room. The smell of fresh-baked cookies soon filled the house. As they sat around the table, sharing cookies and milk, the atmosphere felt lighter than it had in days. Ava's laugh, clear and bright, rang out when Emily told a silly joke, and Michael's eyes sparkled as he reached for another cookie. As evening approached and shadows lengthened across the floor, Ava moved closer to Emily, who was washing dishes at the sink. "I like it here," she whispered, her voice soft but steady. "It feels safe." Emily's hand stilled in the soapy water. "You are safe, Ava," she replied gently. "Always." Later, in the guest room that was slowly becoming their own space, Ava drifted off to sleep, her cherished teddy bear held close. Emily and Mark stood in the doorway, watching the peaceful scene. Their eyes met, sharing a look of quiet hope, knowing that each small moment of joy was a step toward healing. The afternoon sun filled Mark and Emily's house with warm, golden light. In the dining room, Ava sat hunched over a piece of paper, her small fingers carefully guiding colored pencils across the page. Her drawing took shape slowly, 3 figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun. Michael lay on his stomach in the living room, pushing a toy car back and forth across the carpet, making soft vrooming sounds. Emily appeared from the kitchen carrying a tray laden with apple slices and graham crackers. She set it down on the table and settled into the chair beside Ava. Peering at the drawing, her face softened with understanding. "That's beautiful," Emily said gently, noting how Ava had drawn herself, Michael, and their father together, smiling and connected. Ava looked up, a hesitant smile tugging at her lips. "Would you like to write letters to your dad?" Emily suggested, her voice warm and encouraging. "He's in a special place now, working hard to get better." Ava's pencil paused mid-stroke. She stared at the paper for a long moment before nodding slowly. Emily retrieved fresh sheets of paper and more pencils. Ava's hand moved carefully across the page as she wrote, "I hope you're okay. We're safe now." Michael abandoned his car and climbed onto a chair at the table. Emily helped guide his small hand as he drew a red heart on his paper, his expression serious and focused. The front door opened and Mark stepped inside, still in his uniform. He paused, taking in the scene before him, the quiet concentration on the children's faces, the gentle way Emily guided them. Something had shifted in the atmosphere, a lightness that hadn't been there before. Mark joined them at the table, sharing stories about his own childhood, about the treehouse his father had built him, and the time he'd rescued a stray kitten. Ava and Michael listened intently, their eyes bright with interest. As evening approached, they folded the letters carefully and tucked them into envelopes. Ava smoothed her hand over the sealed flap and looked up at Emily and Mark. "Thank you for helping him," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air, full of meaning, as the last rays of sunlight painted the room in warm hues. And the morning light filtered through the gauzy curtains of Emily's home office, casting a soft, warm glow across the room. Ava perched on the edge of a plush armchair, her teddy bear nestled in her lap. The gentle scent of lavender from a diffuser filled the air, creating a soothing atmosphere. Emily sat across from her, maintaining a comfortable distance. "Would you like to tell me about some of your favorite memories?" she asked, her voice gentle and encouraging. Ava's fingers played with the bear's worn ear as she thought. "My mom," she began hesitantly. "She used to sing to us every night. She knew all these songs about the moon and stars." A small smile touched Ava's lips as she continued. "She had this special way of braiding my hair. She called it her princess braid, and she always smelled like vanilla cookies." Emily nodded warmly, noting how Ava's shoulders relaxed as she spoke about these precious memories. "Those sound like beautiful moments. How do you feel when you remember them?" "Happy," Ava whispered, "but also a little sad. Is that okay?" "That's perfectly okay," Emily assured her. "Those memories can be like little treasures that keep us strong." The door creaked open slightly and Michael peeked in. Emily gestured for him to join them, and he padded over to sit beside his sister. Ava automatically reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining. "Michael, would you like to share any memories of your mom too?" Emily asked. Michael's voice was soft but clear. "She laughed a lot, like bells ringing, and she danced with us in the kitchen." Ava squeezed his hand. "Remember when she made us those funny-shaped pancakes?" From the doorway, Mark watched silently, his expression tender as he observed the gentle scene unfolding. The morning sun caught the tears glistening in Emily's eyes as she reached for something in her desk drawer. She pulled out a small blue journal with silver stars on the cover. "Ava, I'd like you to have this," Emily said, holding it out. "You can write down anything you want in here, your feelings, your memories, your thoughts." Ava took the journal carefully, running her fingers over the smooth cover before hugging it to her chest. She looked up at Emily, her eyes bright with emotion. "Can I write to her too?" she asked quietly. Emily's voice was thick with emotion as she replied, "Yes, you can." After about a month, Mark stepped into the rehabilitation center's common room, where a group therapy session was in progress. The circle of chairs held various individuals, but his eyes immediately found Peter, who was speaking in a low, steady voice. "I lost myself after Rachel died," Peter was saying. "I thought the pills would numb the pain, but they just made everything worse." He looked up, catching Mark's eye, and his voice faltered. A mix of shame and cautious hope crossed his face. After the session ended, Peter approached Mark, his steps hesitant but purposeful. Mark reached into his jacket and pulled out 2 folded pieces of paper. "These are from Ava and Michael," he said softly. Peter's hands trembled as he took the letters. He unfolded them carefully, as if they might crumble at his touch. His eyes filled with tears as he read the simple messages his children had written. Michael's small heart drawing made his breath catch. They found a quiet corner where Peter sank into a chair, the letters still clutched in his hands. "I want to do better. For them. I need to," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Mark nodded, settling into the chair across from him. "They're making progress," he shared. "Ava's starting to open up in therapy with Emily. Michael's getting stronger every day. They're beginning to feel safe." Peter wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "Rachel would be so disappointed in what I became," he said quietly. "She was always the strong one, you know. When we first got Ava, Rachel knew exactly how to make her feel at home. She'd braid her hair every morning, sing these silly songs she made up." His voice grew wistful as he continued. "We were happy once. Really happy. Rachel had this way of making everything feel possible. Even when things were tight, she'd find ways to make the kids laugh. She'd dance with them in the kitchen, make up stories at bedtime." Mark listened intently as Peter painted pictures of their life before, weekend picnics, family game nights, holiday traditions that Rachel had carefully crafted. The love was evident in every memory, making the contrast with recent events even more stark. "We're looking at setting up supervised visits," Mark said after a while. "Once you've shown consistent progress here, the kids need to see you're getting better, and you need to prove you can be the father they deserve." Peter straightened in his chair, determination settling over his features. "I'll do whatever it takes," he promised. As Mark stood to leave, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The healing he witnessed in both the children and their father gave him hope that something good could emerge from this painful situation. After Mark's departure, Peter returned to his room. He sat on the edge of his bed, carefully rereading each word his children had written. A smile, small but genuine, broke through his grief as he whispered, "I'll make this right." One day, the evening sun painted the living room in warm amber hues as Ava sat at the dining table, her journal open before her. Her pencil moved across the page with careful, deliberate strokes as she recalled memories of happier times with her father. The way he used to push her on the swings, his laugh when they played board games together, the bedtime stories he'd read before everything changed. Mark entered quietly, noticing her deep concentration. He pulled out a chair and sat beside her, watching as she paused in her writing. "Do you miss him?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle and free of judgment. Ava lifted her eyes to meet his, uncertainty flickering across her face. Her fingers tightened around the pencil as she considered the question. "Sometimes I do," she admitted softly, then added, "But I'm scared." "It's complicated, isn't it?" Mark said, understanding in his eyes. "You can love someone and still be afraid of them." Ava nodded, tears welling up. "I remember when he was nice, when he would make pancakes on Sundays and help me with homework. But then..." Her voice trailed off as she struggled to express the confusion in her heart. Emily walked in, sensing the emotional weight in the room. She moved to Ava's other side and wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "It's okay to feel everything you're feeling, sweetheart," she assured her. "All those feelings are valid." Ava leaned into Emily's embrace, drawing comfort from her warmth. After a moment, she picked up her pencil again and turned to a fresh page in her journal. With determination, she wrote 5 simple words. "I miss you, but I'm scared." She paused, then added, "Please get better." "Would you like me to give this to your father when I visit tomorrow?" Mark asked softly. Ava nodded, carefully tearing the page from her journal and folding it once. She handed it to Mark, a small, hopeful smile tugging at her lips. As night began to fall outside, Ava closed her journal and set it aside. The simple act of writing those words seemed to lift something heavy from her shoulders. The room settled into a peaceful quiet, filled with the gentle promise of healing. That afternoon, birds chirped cheerfully in the branches above, their songs creating an oddly peaceful backdrop to the weight of his visit. He made his way through the familiar hallways, his footsteps echoing against the polished floors until he reached the common area. Peter sat near a window, looking more alert and present than Mark had seen him in weeks. When their eyes met, Peter's face brightened with recognition and hope, a marked change from the broken man Mark had first encountered. "Officer Daniels," Peter said, standing to greet him. His voice was stronger, steadier. Mark pulled Ava's note from his pocket and handed it to Peter. "From Ava," he said simply, watching as Peter's hands trembled while unfolding the paper. Peter's eyes welled with tears as he read the few simple lines. "I'll make her proud," he whispered, carefully folding the note and tucking it into his shirt pocket, close to his heart. The rehabilitation center counselor, Dr. Roberts, approached them with a warm smile. "Peter has been making remarkable progress," she shared, her tone professional but encouraging. "He hasn't missed a single session and actively participates in all group activities." Peter nodded, a hint of pride crossing his features. "The group, they understand what it's like," he explained. "We all have different stories, but the pain, the regret, it's something we share. It helps to know I'm not alone." Mark listened intently as Peter described his therapy sessions, noting the clear-headed way he spoke about his struggles and his determination to change. "If you continue like this," Mark said carefully, "we might be able to arrange a supervised visit with Ava and Michael soon." Peter's eyes lit up with hope and determination. He sat straighter in his chair, squaring his shoulders. "I'll be ready," he said with conviction, his voice steady and sure. As Mark prepared to leave, he felt a growing sense of optimism. The changes in Peter were real and tangible, matching the slow but steady healing he witnessed in Ava and Michael at home. Hope was taking root on both sides of this broken family, growing stronger with each passing day. The morning sun cast long shadows across the driveway as Ava stood at the window, her small fingers pressed against the cool glass. Her heart fluttered like a trapped bird in her chest as she watched and waited. In the kitchen, Emily packed apple slices and granola bars into a brown paper bag, adding extra napkins with careful consideration. Michael bounced around the living room, his energy infectious as he chattered about seeing their father. His innocence showed in his bright eyes and eager smile, untouched by the deeper complexities of the situation. "Ready?" Mark asked gently, car keys jingling in his hand. Emily placed a reassuring hand on Ava's shoulder as they walked to the car. The drive was quiet, broken only by Michael's occasional excited comments and the soft hum of the engine. Ava clutched her worn teddy bear closer as they pulled into the rehabilitation center's parking lot. The building looked less intimidating than she'd imagined, with flowering bushes lining the walkway and warm light streaming through large windows. Inside, a counselor led them to a specially prepared room. Soft couches and comfortable chairs created a living room atmosphere, and warm lighting gave the space a cozy feel. Peter was already there, standing nervously by a window, his hands fidgeting as he waited. When Ava and Michael entered, time seemed to freeze. Peter's eyes filled with tears as he dropped to his knees, his voice breaking as he whispered, "I'm so sorry." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Michael broke the tension first, running forward without hesitation. His small arms wrapped around Peter's neck in a tight embrace that made Peter's shoulders shake with silent sobs. He held his son close, tears streaming freely down his face. Ava watched the scene unfold, her bear pressed tightly against her chest. Her eyes studied her father's face, searching for signs of the man she remembered from happier times. She saw remorse etched in every line of his expression, genuine and raw. Taking small steps forward, Ava approached them. Her hand trembled as she reached out, placing it gently on Peter's shoulder. The touch was light, tentative, but it carried the weight of forgiveness beginning to take root. They spent the next hour sharing quiet conversations. Peter listened as Michael told him about his new toy car, and Ava showed him some drawings from her journal. They remembered happy moments together, birthday cakes, park visits, and bedtime stories, while acknowledging the pain that had followed. Peter made promises, his voice steady and sure about the future he wanted to build with them. He talked about his therapy, his progress, and his determination to be the father they deserved. As the visit drew to a close, Ava looked directly into her father's eyes. "I hope you keep your promise," she whispered, her voice small but clear. Peter nodded, his expression a mixture of love and determination as they said their goodbyes. The late afternoon sun painted warm streaks across the living room floor as Ava and Michael stepped into Mark and Emily's home. The familiar scent of cinnamon and fresh laundry wrapped around them like a comforting blanket. Michael's earlier excitement had mellowed into quiet contemplation, while Ava's shoulders carried the weight of mixed emotions. Emily guided them to the cozy living room sofa, where soft cushions welcomed their tired bodies. She sat between them, her presence steady and reassuring. Mark settled into his favorite armchair across from them, his kind eyes watching over his growing family. "How do you feel about seeing your dad?" Emily asked gently, her hand resting lightly on Ava's shoulder. Ava twisted the ear of her teddy bear, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think he'll really change?" Mark leaned forward, his expression serious but gentle. "It takes time, but he's trying, and we'll be here every step of the way." The tension in Ava's shoulders eased slightly as she leaned into Emily's embrace, finding comfort in the warmth of her presence. Michael's eyes brightened suddenly as a memory surfaced. "Dad used to play guitar for us," he shared, his face lighting up with a smile. "He knew all our favorite songs." Emily smiled warmly, running her fingers through Michael's hair. "Maybe we can plan another visit soon. We'll take it one step at a time, okay?" The evening transitioned into dinner preparations, with Ava and Michael helping to set the table. Plates clinked softly against the wooden surface as Mark entertained them with a story about a lost puppy that had wandered into the police station that day. His animated gestures and silly voices filled the kitchen with genuine laughter. After dinner, while Michael played with his toy cars on the living room rug, Ava sat cross-legged on her bed with her journal open. Her pencil moved steadily across the page as she poured out her feelings about seeing her father again. Outside on the porch, Mark and Emily stood together in the growing darkness. Stars dotted the velvet sky above them as crickets chirped their evening song. Mark's arm found its way around Emily's shoulders, pulling her close. "We're doing the right thing," he said softly, his voice carrying conviction. Emily nodded, a gentle smile gracing her features as they gazed through the window at Ava and Michael playing inside. The warm glow from the house spilled onto the porch, creating a peaceful tableau of their expanding family. If you enjoyed the story of Mark and Emily, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.